Hello and welcome back to another video exploration of the story. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos weekly as a companion to a Bible study that we are doing within my congregation based on something called The Story. Kind of looks like this in its first printing, looks a little different in its second, but The Story is a condensed biblical narrative put together a few years back by a guy named Randy Frazee. And he condenses the biblical narrative into more of a novel type form with quite a bit of the actual quoted narrative out of the scripture, and then some of the gaps are filled in with more like summary situations. But so that's kind of what the story is. It's a wonderful resource for getting into the Bible and starting to gain a little bit of knowledge of the overarching story that is going on from start to finish. And we've been looking in my congregation at a chapter a week. And then, of course, as I mentioned, I prepare these videos to kind of go along with that for those who weren't able to be there. This particular week, we looked at chapter 14, which is entitled A Kingdom Torn in Two. This picks up right after the death of King Solomon. Who was, if you happen to catch last week's video, he was the third king of Israel and the final king of the what they call the United Kingdom of all 12 tribes of Israel. However, as we again heard last week, because of his turning away from God and beginning to worship false gods and to make sacrifices to false gods, basically kind of taking on the religious culture of many of his wives, which he had a ton. God has prophesied that, or told Solomon that I will rip your kingdom away from you, but out of regard for your father David, I won't do it in your lifetime, but I will do it in the lifetime of your son. So Solomon has now died. Kind of in between these two chapters, and we pick up with his son Rehoboam, as well as Rehoboam's adversary Jeroboam. They have very similar names, and because of that, I tend to call them Jerry and Ray. It's just easier for me to do, and we joked about that quite a bit in our conversation last night. But essentially what happens is Jeroboam, or Jerry, is one of those rising stars, and we've heard this kind of story before. It's very similar in scope to the relationship between King Saul, who was the first king, and David, the second king, of course, that Jeroboam, or Jerry, serves under Solomon, and he's very popular, and he is very able, and continues to rise up through the ranks, and to the point where his popularity is such as that he thinks I can take over, and attempts to, or at least we think he attempts to. We're not actually sure what goes on. The narrative is kind of ambiguous as to what exactly is happening. But Solomon catches wind that Jerry is kind of getting a little uppity. And Solomon still has enough power that he could have Jerry killed, and so he runs off to Egypt and hides out there until such time as Solomon dies. Then when he catches word that Solomon has now died, news travels very fast around the region, just because of Solomon's incredible popularity and influence. So then Jeroboam comes back and kind of rallies the people to come together at what would be the coronation of Rehoboam, Solomon's son. Now, what happens with Rehoboam is first, immediately when he becomes king, he starts talking to some of his father's advisors, and says that actually, you know what? I need to back up just a little bit. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself as I talk about the background. I need to fill in a few more of the gaps as to where we see this within Scripture. Most of this portion, and it's actually a pretty brief chapter, occurs again within First Kings. That's kind of where we've been for the last week or so. And just a short amount of it, only about 4 chapters within it. And ironically, something I discovered in preparation for last night's discussion was, in addition to occurring in First Kings, it's repeated verbatim, or at least portions of it are verbatim in Second Chronicles. And interestingly enough, that points towards the notion that whoever wrote Second Chronicles, which is thought to be newer than First and Second Kings, had that little brief snippet as a resource and copied it and used it. And then this wasn't unheard of. This happened quite a bit within these scriptures, or the various scriptures. So that's kind of where it's found. And after this brief portion in First Kings, then the story kind of switches over, and we start to hear more about some of the important prophets, like Elijah, who's the first major big prophet after Samuel, and then Elisha, again, very common names, who followed after Elijah. So that's where we're going to switch into, and that's a preview of next week as they really kind of encounter and come up against the kings of both Israel and Judah. Again, getting ahead of myself just a little bit, but that's kind of what's coming up. Okay, now I'm kind of getting back to Rehoboam. So he becomes king, and initially all the people come before him, and they say, we have your father was harsh with us, and he was. Solomon, his great riches came at the expense of his own people. And we talked about how God foresaw that way back before the kings even began. He told the people, you want a king, this is what's going to happen. And lo and behold, it did. But yet they've had the kings anyway. So Solomon has conscripted labor, heavy taxation, and the people didn't really like it, but there wasn't much they could do about it. So they come to Ray and they say, hey, your father treated us poorly. If you treat us well, we will follow you forever and everything will go good. So Ray's got this choice. Do I treat the people well? Do I serve as a humble leader type shepherd for God's people, because that's what God intended the king to be? Or do I get harsh with them like my dad did? And so first he goes and he talks to his father's advisors, like I mentioned a moment ago, and they tell him, you have this opportunity. Treat them well, and they will serve you forever. But then he thinks, well, I'm going to go talk to some other friends. So he goes and talks to his buddies who basically grew up with him, and they're like, no, man, be a jerk. Be tough. Be strong. Exert your influence on them and benefit from it. And that's what he ends up going with. So we talk some about how when we surround ourselves with yes men, that's kind of the phrase, with people who think the same way we do, it doesn't always go well. And that's where having different opinions, different experiences, different voices within our council is always an important aspect of a discernment. So we talked some about that. But so Rehoboam comes back to the people and he says, boy, you thought my dad was tough. You ain't seen nothing yet. And immediately Jerry says, fine. And everyone else crowns him king of Israel, except for the tribe of Judah and the small tribe of Benjamin, which remain loyal in the south to Ray. So now we've got this split. 10 tribes go off in the north, and they form the kingdom of Israel, where in the south we have the kingdom of Judah, which is the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. And so that happens right away. But here's the funny thing. Neither one of these kings are good. They both reigned quite a while. Jerry in the north for like 30 some odd years, and Ray in the south for like 17 years. So they both reigned for a long, long, long time. But now we see this division. And we see that God's own people, the kingdom of Israel, the people of Israel, are now kind of their own worst enemies. And even though there are some outside adversaries from neighboring countries over the course of the next few centuries, we see that the main battles, the main aggression happens between these two kingdoms who are relatives of each other. So we talk some about why is that. Now, one of the things that Jerry did in the north, which was really smart from a political sense, but really stupid from a faith sense, was he recognized that with the center of worship being in Jerusalem, where the temple was, and that being in the south within Judah, he thought if the people continue to go down there, Rehoboam will turn them back away from me. He will reclaim all the people because he controls the center of worship. He controls where God is in the temple. And so he goes off and he creates two new temples, one clear up in the north and one on the south end of his area of control, and builds or has crafted golden calves to put in each one, idols, false idols. And yet, in something that directly mirrors what we saw with Moses and Aaron way back in Exodus, he says, these are your gods who brought you out of Egypt, just like Aaron had said when he created the golden calf while Moses was up the mountain getting the Ten Commandments from God. So we see this repeat again. And it's intended that these are the places where you worship God, but we've created false images for you. And in addition, so there's that going on, but also Jeroboam is influenced with cultic worship of various types too. And so his leadership of the people is flawed from the get-go. They're not following God. Likewise, Rehoboam, doing more of the same down below, following in his father's footsteps and the influence of his father and the false worship that's going on there. So neither one of these two guys is doing really well. But as I mentioned, they continue to butt heads with one another throughout the course of this time. Now, as we see the split in the kingdom, things start to get really kind of confusing, and it was the agreement of everyone in our conversation last night that this chapter was confusing because there's so much back and forth between the two kingdoms. So far we've been one people or one kingdom for the last several chapters, and now all of a sudden it splits, and so now we have two kings, and one king reigns for this amount of time, and this king down here reigns for a certain amount of time, and then this guy comes in, and then this guy comes in, and this guy comes in. So the tail end of this chapter, we see a skip of quite a few different kings, and it's hard to keep track of. You got to really pay attention. You almost need a flow chart to see who's in the north in Israel, who's in the south in Judah. You can track it, but it's tedious. And that's a lot of what goes on within specifically within Chronicles, that you hear a lot of. In the 14th year of this king in Israel, this guy became king in Judah, and he reigned for 6 years. And in the 4th year of this guy, king of Judah, this guy became king of Israel. He reigned for 18 years. And it's back and forth like that. And and most of the kings were pretty poor. God was not pleased with them. Every once in a while, we hear that there are good kings, and we hear of one of them in the chapter this week, Asa, who is a king in Judah, so in the south, in David's line, and he is actually the grandson of Rehoboam, so great-grandson of Solomon, great-great-grandson of David. He's compared to David. It says he is a king in line with David, and so he tried to expel all the false worship, all the cultic practices, and lead the people back to God. And he reigns for quite a long time. His reign is apparently blessed, but then he dies and things kind of fall apart again. There are two comparisons that we need to go on as we start to look at this transition into the two kingdoms. And in the north, in Israel, that is the kingdom that was taken away from the line of Solomon. The monarchs there have very short family histories, if you're following me. So like Jeroboam reigns for his 17 odd years, then his son comes in. Well, during the time of his son, there's an uprising, and it's a very brief amount of time. So there's an uprising, and his family is wiped out, and a new king comes in. Well, that new king lasts hardly any time at all, like a week, because he was a general, and another general comes up and rises up, and this first general ends up killing himself, and the next general becomes king. And that's kind of the history of Israel all the way through for a few hundred years until the Assyrian Empire gains momentum and comes in and wipes out Israel and hauls them off into exile. And So that's kind of the history there. Now, on the flip side, down in the south, in Judah, out of the promise made to David, God keeps David's line on the throne in Judah. And I did a little research to check and make sure, but David's descendants remain the monarchs in Judah all the way through about another 100 or so odd years past when Israel is wiped out by the Assyrians until the Babylonians have risen in power and they come in and wipe out Judah in the south and destroy the temple in Jerusalem and haul those people off into exile. And that's some foreshadowing ahead to like the story of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they're off in exile. So that's kind of where that comes from. So there's that distinction between the two kingdoms of in the north, which was ripped away from the because of the sin of Solomon. That's very chaotic. Whereas in the south, in the kingdom of Judah, remains in the same family, although they all have their issues too. So that was kind of what's going on in our chapter this week. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of names. It does get confusing, but the long and short of it is these kings that God has raised up as shepherds for his people do poorly for the most part. Again, there are exceptions. There were some decent kings, but for the most part, they lead their people astray, and God is not happy with them. And that's why God allows these other empires to come in and wipe them out to the point where the kingdoms don't exist anymore. Now, if you have any thoughts or questions or comments that you'd like to add to the conversation, please, by all means, share those down below in the comment section, and we can continue it that way. Otherwise, I hope this has been helpful to gain some insight into the tangent that goes on when the kingdom splits into two different ones and they go kind of in their own directions and butt heads with one another the entire time. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week. We'll catch you next time. God bless.